أهلا وسهلا فيكم مرة ثانية. الآن حنتكلم عن المجتمعات الإبداعية وإيش الإضافة الاجتماعية اللي تقدمها هذه المجتمعات. معانا ريبيكا آن بروكتر، رئيسة التحرير السابقة لمجلة بازار. نشرت كتاباتها في نيويورك تايمز، ستايل ماجازين، بلومبرج، بزنس ويك، The Art Newspaper وThe Forward. حصلت على ماجستير في تاريخ الفن الحديث والمعاصر من جامعة كريستيز في لندن، وماجستير مزدوج من الدراسات في الشرق الأوسط والدراسات الإسلامية وحل النزاعات في الجامعة الأمريكية في باريس، وماجستير علم الصراعات من المعهد الكاثوليكي في باريس. تؤكد بروكتر من خلال عملها أن الفن والثقافة هما وسيلة لتعزيز الحوار بين الثقافات وتحفيز التغيير الاجتماعي والاقتصادي. Hello, Rebecca Ann.
Thank you so much, Rima. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Ann Proctor, and I'm a journalist and an art consultant based in Dubai. And it's a great pleasure to be here today to moderate this talk on creative communities. What is their social contribution to society? Entrepreneurial models should cultural practitioners be following? And I'm joined by an exciting group of panelists, creative thinkers and entrepreneurs. Butheina Kazim, founder of Cinema Keel, which is based in Dubai and is the first fully fledged art house in the Gulf. Touria El Glaoui, the founder and director of 154 Contemporary African Art Fair. And Abdulrahman Gazzaz, the founder of Brick Lab, the Jeddah-based design studio. And I've had the great privilege of working with all of you over the last few years. And before I delve into the questions, which are very exciting today to discuss all about creative communities working today in the Middle East and Africa, I just wanted to say thank you to the MISC Art Institute and the program's curator, Laura Edgerton, for bringing us together. So firstly, each of you are pioneers in the creative sector and have set up your organizations literally from scratch, from the ground up. And I'd love to learn a bit about the particular structural models and financial framework on which each of your concepts is based. So I'd like to start first with Butheina, which we're really privileged in Dubai to have this incredible cinema in Al that's based on the art house model. Tell us a little bit about how you initiated and grew Cinema Keel. How was it structured and how was it continuing to go forward?
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see everyone here, despite the circumstances and distance. We're lucky to have you in the same city, coming into the cinema, even with our social distancing format that we're following right now. We actually met the first time we spoke about Cinema Keel was during the time that we didn't actually have a space. So Cinema Keel was very much and still remains a very iterative project. It started on the basis of addressing a gap or rather a larger frustration in not having access to mostly content from the Middle East and North African region outside of the film festival circuit, which now we're operating in a very different context. I mean, what's great to see as part of even this virtual forum, the presence of the Red Sea Film Festival, which everybody is looking forward to this year. The Dubai Film Festival, the Abu Dhabi Film Festival have ceased operations over the past a couple of years or 3 years, and there was a huge gap left in the market to present films and to have access to films that are close to home. The multiplex proliferation in the UAE is one of the highest in the world per capita. Yet the presentation of independent, art house, regional productions was so scarce outside of the festival circuit or the private cine club circuit that we really felt there was a market for creation of a public platform that made these films accessible. So what we started with was experimentations, a lot of partnerships in spatial takeovers. We started with a nomadic model, a pop-up model to keep our operations very lean, and avoided having the brick and mortar format until we had enough years of experience, feedback, and sentiments really gathered to build this space around. We didn't really want to replicate anything that existed. We didn't want to build a Curzon or an MK2 or a film forum or a Movimento or all these models that we were looking at around the world or even in the region. Like, you have great players like Metropolis in Beirut or Zawiya in Egypt, or Sivatek in Cairo. We became a member of the network of Arab art house screens, but we didn't really want to create a satellite version of that, or a parachuted equivalent. We wanted something that was very responsive to the space. And lo and behold, the nomadic experience has always been indigenous and has always been part and parcel of the way of life and the way of of adaptation. So it felt very natural to start with that, and we partnered with everything from basketball courts to galleries to parks, beaches, taking over different spaces and thinking really from the get-go around a more eventized, experiential cinematic experience rather than a singular space. And that is something that we continue to do. In September 2018, we opened the first space in Al Sarkal Avenue in partnership with Al Sarkal Avenue, with like-minded partners and neighbors and a community that really would continue the conversation that we were presenting through the language of cinema outside of the space and in the neighborhood. So there was sort of a really important emphasis on the right timing partnerships for the model to really work. And it became the first art house cinema, single screen cinema with 133 seats in Al Sarkal Avenue.
And you have, you show regular films and series of films. Maybe just tell us briefly a little bit about the program, because it's so rich. Over the summer, during these very strange times, I was going every single Friday, and Butheina had this incredible program put together.
Yeah, we were lucky to see you over the course of the return post-lockdown. We had a very experimental program. So what happened was, after we shut down during the lockdown, we returned with a completely new lineup, and focused on the idea of travel, and derived a lot of our programming from this the catering to the wanderlust through films that are timeless classics. And that was always part of our mandate. Part of it was showing and privileging content from the larger regions, Middle East and North African content primarily, but also films from Sub-Saharan Africa, from East Africa, and what we consider the larger region surrounding us in Dubai and and South Asia as well. So we really wanted to have a well-rounded cinematic offering or programmatic offering that was outside the Bollywood, Malayalam, Tamil cinema offering, the pop Egyptian offering, and of course Hollywood. So that was our world in a nutshell. And we wanted to escape the idea of the world cinema category, and started to program around those lines. We don't have a clear programmatic mix, but we do everything from experimental to repertory, a lot of repertory cinema. So this is something that we started to do since the nomadic days, bringing films that you had seen, or timeless classics from around the world, and presenting them as part of a focus of not only a nostalgic return to cinema, but also a larger understanding of different cinematic languages, everything from Agnes Varda to Eisenstein to Fellini to you name it, to Yusuf Shaheen, the whole gamut of what forms our cinematic language and tracks the sort of trajectory of the history of movie making and filmmaking, and informs the cinema that we have access to today or are making today. So yeah, that definitely falls into our mix. And we have different film festivals or film weeks, and focuses on specific, whether it's national lines or thematic lines, in and out of our space. So right now we have a sort of a return to the repertory and the classic lineup through our outdoor cinema, which has a very specific program. We're doing a tribute to Maradona through Emir Kusturica's 2008 original biography. And in our space, we're showing a completely different lineup of the focus on documentary with Totally Under Control. And we are going to close the year with Muhammad Rasulov's There Is No Evil, which won the Golden Bear. So it's quite diverse and remains experimental.
Fantastic. And Touria 154 Contemporary African Art Fair first kicked off in London in 2013, and it now holds fairs in Marrakesh and New York. I've been traveling to all of them for the last few years, and I've really learned so much from you and from the fair. as have many, about African art. And the fair, really has served as this catalyst for the growth of the African art market. I don't think we'd be where we are without 154. How have you based 154 on the traditional art fair model? I mean, tell us a little bit about the structure of the fair.
Okay, so it is based on the traditional art fair model, and you have to remember that when I started, 154, which stands for one continent, 54 countries, the African art market was really, and the art fairs were completely non-accessible and a very challenging route for artists from the African continent and the African diaspora. So I think it meant that, all the collectors, all the institution, had absolutely no access to artists from Africa and the African diaspora, because mainly those, acquisitions were done through art fairs. So for me, the model of the art fairs were instrumental, because we didn't want to be close to a model that was, again, a charitable organization, for Africa. We wanted something that was considered, the Art Basel for African artists. So the only difference between our model and other art fair models is that we're very independent, we're a very small structure, but we are trying to basically put Africa and the African diaspora at the center of what we do. And that was really building a platform in response, to the non-inclusive aspect of other art fairs. So what you have to understand is that when we started in 2013, the market research showed that there was only 0.05% of artists from Africa and the African diaspora represented in the art market in general. And today, unfortunately, the last FIAC, as much as we feel there's definitely more visibility and more access to art thanks to 154 and maybe other platforms, we're still around 4% of representation of African artists in a fair like FIAC or Art Basel or Frieze. So we have a long way to go. I think the model itself is a model that is, have nothing different than, the model of Art Basel or Frieze or one of those big art fairs. The galleries are at the center of the work. We have a selection process. We are functioning like in the same, in the same structure organization as a mainstream art fair. The only thing that is very different is that we obviously, promoting artists from Africa and the African diaspora as our primary, focus. And this, help, bring visibility and access. And I think one of the big reasons of, African artists not being part of the global, narrative was definitely that there was no access to them. It was not really something that international collectors would go to Africa, to find, young, very talented artists. And I think it's still not the case. So I think bringing access to those artists to the global stage, in cities like, New York, London, was very important to be part of this global narrative and make sure that, this whole, in a way, part of the world was not forgotten or not, not included in this narrative that was written of contemporary art. So I think this is why we built it this way. We really wanted a model that was, sustainable, model. And honestly, being independent and such a small, structure, we're able to also answer the different market needs that, are we seeing that are relevant to what we do. So, I mean, it's very challenging, but I think, part of wanting to build a market is also our willingness to be able to be adaptable, change and keep relevant every edition. So we decided to, start and launch, 154 in one of what we thought, the art hub of Europe, which was London, and to make sure that we had as maximum visibility for those artists and those from the continent and from the African diaspora. And then as soon as that model and that blueprint was successful and we saw the enthusiasm of the international collector base, for this market, we moved to New York because we thought that this was where the largest number of institutions and international collectors with a really strong impact on the journey of those artists were. So we started in 2015, 2 years later in New York, and that really helped, give us also a global, visibility to be in London and in New York. And for us, Marrakesh and the returning to the African continent was as important because of the core of our business being African, so it was important to go back on the continent and also build, a network of community around what we were doing that was based on the African continent. And I think the strength is really having this network on the 3 continents right now, and these communities in all those different cities that give us access all year long, to this market. but definitely an art fair traditional art model.
Yes. Well, it's every time I go, I'm a huge I'm a huge fan of 154, and it's really we're at a time where Africa is really sort of spearheading a new narrative. Well, a narrative, as Touria was just saying, that really hasn't been in the mainstream narrative, and I think that's what's so crucial. But it's also what's so crucial about these small cultural enterprises. We're all here today to talk about that sort of as in terms of agility and flexibility and how to kind of maneuver a market that's continually shifting. And with that, I'd like to turn to Abdulrahman, who founded Brick Lab in 2015 with your brother Turkey. And the concept, which you're going to explain further right now, explores the boundaries between artistic practices, material research, and the built environment. And you recently won in November 2019 the Art Jamil International Design Award for the construction of Hay Cinema. So that actually links to Cinema Akil in some ways. It's another independent cinema house, and which is going to be opening in Jeddah soon, I hope. I think you'll tell us. So tell us a little bit about your model as a sort of independent architectural design practice. So how are you structured exactly?
So for us, I mean, if I just rewind back, for us it was more kind of a critical question about the role of architecture and the built environment within our cities. We were working in regular architecture firms, but also kind of I've worked in sculpture, photography, different mediums. I would say my whole life. So did Turkey, and I think for us it was almost something that was intuitive. We reached a point where we started kind of, I don't want to say frustrated, but we started noticing that the realm of architecture was too restricted within the offices that were available at the time, and at around 2014, 2015, of which we started Brick Lab. So it's really a question of what can we provide for the community? How can we actually kind of blur these boundaries between what architecture really is in terms of scale, texture, materiality, and even more so the process itself. So it's kind of a way for us to reach out to different community members, whether be it in molding and casting or creating. We started, when we first started our office, it was just like a one-man show from home, and eventually kept moving up and up. We moved to a graphic designer's office, to operated from there for 2 years, and now we finally moved to our own office about 2 years ago. So I think the very premise of Brick Lab, we started with talks to kind of reach out to the education community. We had the opportunity to participate in shows. So I think we're more of a yes men or a yes team to whatever, and kind of question what is the role of architecture, and how can we start looking at specific things that really reflect our societies. The more and more we practice here, the more and more we find ourselves rooted in Jeddah and also around the region. It's more of creating this understanding, and kind of we've also taught in the university, and we found that the way the students saw themselves in architecture was very one-dimensional, and that's one thing. It's not one dimension. The realm of architecture can range between writing all the way to being an artist. So it's been a really interesting time when we first started, because that was, for us, it was a means for us to inspire and educate ourselves, and also connect with various members of the community. So I would say it's a very critical approach towards what architecture really is, and how does it engage within our cities. And thankfully, I feel it resonated with a lot of people. We're really happy to see that there's a lot of emerging artists and architects and designers that have different approaches towards the disciplines. I think one of the most things that was interesting for us is, again, Hay Cinema was a project for us that we experimented with material. We questioned the very brief that was given to us, and what can it do to to contribute to the rest of the film society that exists in Jeddah. So this is more kind of an analogy towards our practice. We started interviewing filmmakers, directors, artists about what do you want in this space? How can a cinema or an art house cinema actually alleviate everything that we're doing? So we found that the archival material that was available in Jeddah was very limited. So that was our kind of counterpart to the cinema, is to introduce an archive or a library, a space for filmmakers and different creative fields to really merge together. And I think this is the narrative that we follow. I mean, we experimented with the materials as an expression of what we wanted to do, ended up using concrete and vinyl flakes, concrete being kind of one of the materials that were most heavily used post-oil boom, which was right before or kind of during the cinema ban in Saudi. So everything for us, we kind of try to weave in notions of community all the way towards the very architecture and this kind of tactile approach, because we inhabit spaces. We tend to interact with certain materials or atmospheres without really realizing that, because that's more kind of in the realm of phenomenology. Everything is intertwined, is what I'm trying to say, and I feel it's been a journey that I feel like it's still a learning curve, and we're still learning. I mean, also before that, we had the opportunity to do the Venice Architecture Biennale with MISC Art Institute. And I feel like that also gave us, it was a platform that was created for us to kind of work abroad and kind of showcase what Saudi is. So yeah, that's pretty much of how we started.
I love the idea of fluidity, because I think, which is something, agility, fluidity, sort of, I think as a small cultural enterprise, you really are, there's this notion of adaptability, particularly in the times that we're living now. And obviously this talk is not a COVID talk. We've done lots of those this year, but there's that notion of kind of, there's a going with the flow, but being inspired, kind of using what's around you, what's around your immediate environment, but also pulling in stuff, internationally. And on that note, I kind of want to get a little bit into now more this constant oscillation, when you have a cultural enterprise, between the idealism of why you set up, there's ultimately this real hope, this real aspiration, idealism of, giving something back to society, of changing the market. And also the pragmatism needed to continue to survive. And a very, the cultural field is not an easy market. And, there are, as we sort of mentioned when we spoke the other day, sort of the existential threats to the existence of a smaller organization. And this year has certainly brought in a few of those challenges. So I'd love to kind of, get from each of you a bit how you've been able to be fluid, let's use that word, fluid, in a situation that might sometimes make you be a bit fragile. Obviously everybody's been a bit fragile this year. And how you've kind of used that fluidity to your advantage, perhaps. So maybe I'd love to start first with Touria, because she's one of the only art fairs that was able to go ahead, that decided to go ahead this October in London, even, as Art Basel and Frieze were cancelled or postponed. And it was that ability, that to go forward, which the African art market, as we just said, is still young and is still fragile in some ways, and some of these galleries are really at risk in a market like this of non-existence. So I'd love to know kind of, how did you adapt,
So there was just a decision made in the summer, when Frieze, which has our biggest, fair around us, cancelled for October, which was about, do we still exist without them, or do we still, we stop all that we do because they decided to not go ahead with it. And to be honest, in our situation and in our fragility, the fact is that most of the big collectors continue to buy around, the social lockdown and the measures, but they bought, artists they knew from galleries they knew from a very long time. And I think the for us, what was instrumental was that we still needed to do a lot of work in terms of introducing all those new artists and those new names, to the collector base, the international collector base. And the fact that we were small and our fair is taking place in an art center in London, it was a bit of a bet, but it was also, a really strong collaboration with our main venue space, which was functioning like a museum and had different measures, to continue the fair. So knowing we had that secured with them, help us also make the right decision to actually, go ahead and do a smaller fair, even if it was not the same size type of fair, but for that particular moment. And I think it worked out, and I think people were able to buy and very excited that there was a real life event going on in London during this Freeze Week, where everybody had to apply a different type of skills, because we were under pre-lockdown type of situation. But I think at the end of the day, the fact that we're small, the fact that it's a very special period, we were given a lot of collaborative, opportunities. And I think this is why being small in a way and independent is very helpful sometimes. So for example, we had the possibility to have our platform online built by Christie's, because they wanted to support, and there was an amazing collaboration there because they didn't have any of the African artists, representation in their structures. So they were really happy to do that for us. And I think being small in a way, the importance of going and continue to build this market that we started and worked so hard for 8 years to start, giving and having visibility was important, but also being able to adapt and take whatever was offered to us, to be able to continue what we were doing and continue this visibility was very important. So I would say that, we always are trying to encourage this sustainable growth, for our little market. But I think the fact is that we are in a different situation, being small, being independent. We are able to be adaptable and being very collaborative, which is something that I think saved us this year.
Yes, and Butheina the same. You also have been, you've had to adapt to, well, not just, adapt to the environment. Yes. So we're back. We've had a little bit of a small technical issue, but we're back for our last and quite exciting question that I'd love us to quickly discuss is ultimately how these small social small cultural enterprises, what is their role in society? And I think more than ever we've realized, especially this year, is that the arts and the culture sector really it's about giving back, a lot of the time. And I think sometimes we don't realize the influence and the education that can happen, through smaller organizations, as well as bigger organizations, but really the role that they have to play in society in terms of education, in terms of also just showing people, moments of beauty or moments of pain or moments of, catharsis. So with that said, I'd love to turn to Butheina and talk, quickly about sort of the language of film, and how would you basically define, Cinema Kiel's contribution to society? Is this something that you've been actively working to achieve? How does film? Film ultimately is, it's an emotional, it's an art form. It's touching not just the smaller community, but the greater whole, the greater society that we live in, and you're obviously a part of that.
Yeah, that's the sort of the romantic, end of the equation, right? Our work kind of oscillates between the extreme, entrenchment in the poetry and the romanticism around the language of film, and and the cinematic experience and the medium and the congregation around the cinema, the shared cinema experience. So that's something that we're constantly engaged with and asking about, and working towards with our programming and with the spatial considerations and with everything else that we do. But on the flip side of that, obviously, is the sort of the sheer ruthless pragmatism that governs the way that we work, and that has a lot to do with the your previous question, which is the kind of the romanticism of the startup or the the cultural enterprise startup model as this nimble, quick, self-correcting enterprise, where in reality, this status is governed by a lot of precarity, not only from the industry dynamics, the technological disruptions that every industry is faced with, But a lot of it has to do with, with the realities of, legislative, questions, or, the lack of infrastructure or the ecosystem. I think one thing that's, that's a common denominator in this conversation is a kind of a departure point. Some call it frustration, some call it, curiosity or inclination towards a particular end goal or a gap in society or contribution that is, that governs the, philosophy or the existential question of why we're here and what we're here to serve and the communities we're here to cater to. But part of that equation also puts the onus a lot, heavily on the shoulders of the cultural enterprise to achieve and to cater to and to do a lot more than be a part of the ecosystem. And I think that's one thing we need to all be, thinking about and having, in this forum, I think is really important to reflect on, is how do we create an infrastructure or an environment that allows for more cultural enterprises to enter the market, to be able to feed off each other, so that you don't have a situation where, an art fair plays the role of an education space and a fellowship and a residency and a networking space. A cinema, it doesn't have to play the role of an educator. And I mean, and those are things that, that you will continue to do in your capacity. But I think the more players that, that are allowed to exist or supported to exist, through, I mean, especially this year, it was a good learning curve. Yes, we were able to adapt. Yes, we were able to, both spatially and, programmatically and, from a very lean overhead structure, be able to pivot and try different things. But that's just out of, desperation. And that's the thing that makes you nimble. And that's the reality. I mean, it's, it's the need to exist and to continue to want to serve your community. So you always have that, view at hand. But that also means when you're really, community is one of those words that, we like to throw around, in this space. And I think, what that really meant for us in the beginning of the pandemic, when there were a lot of the questions, is the speed by which we had to make the decision to shut down. Because if we really were about the community, then, then making a decision that privileged the well-being and that consideration meant that we had to compromise on our side without a cushion, without, a relief structure, without, a lot of a bounce back. So I think those are things that we need to be, really aware of, and can really, push us forward into the next stage of building a more cohesive, more sustainable, arts and culture enterprise friendly environment or market.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have to, these words that we use so often, community, social enterprise. I mean, I think it's, especially as a writer, as a journalist, you question the words that we use, and ultimately, yes, it is about creating a friendly environment, but it's an environment, as you're saying, that oscillation, that tension between, existing because of this idealism, because of this desire to give back and do something new, but also the pragmatism of how it is to run, financially and financially and socially, to maintain a business that relies a lot on outside funding and other support mechanisms. But, on that note, I think, Touria, what you've done for African art, obviously the art fair is a commercial enterprise, but art fairs have become now sort of the nucleus of the art world, so to speak, because, the art fair is a lot. It is where there's talks, there's lunches, there's networking events, there's, we've kind of, this year, we've lost that in some ways. But it also is a place, it's become not just a place of buying and selling, but it's a place to learn, to educate as well. So, and on that note, I'd love you to talk a little bit about sort of, as an art fair, this giving back to society again, your role. Well, maybe it's not the biggest role, but it obviously is something that's happened almost naturally. It's changed.
Yeah, I think just by the fact of existing to be as 154, which is obviously centering on Africa and the African diaspora, we're really addressing, the non-inclusive aspect of all those art, platforms. So that's, also our point here. And I think what we've been able to primarily achieve with 154 and that we would like to continue is by representing this diversity of work and practices from across the continent under a single roof, is really dismantling this misconception of a very singular, aesthetic and so forth, So, I mean, one way in our impact is definitely, we want to have an impact on the journey of all the artists on the continent, making them able to continue their journeys as, creatives. But, the fact is what we can only do right now is encourage the sustainable of the market growth, make sure that we engage in really committed practices of collecting and not put investment at our forefront, so that we don't create a bubble of any kind of similar to China or something like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, it is about trying to make sure that this inclusion is happening forward, and that we're not going back to any kind of global market where this part of the continent was not, included. And obviously this has, amazing impact on all the ecosystem on the continent, on the African diaspora, and it's, providing, artists with, access to the largest collector, being able to make a living, and obviously developing for a lot of cases, a creative art scenes of where they're coming from. And to be honest, we've seen this since the past years we've been working. Most of the most established artists in Africa are going back home, or building a community, or building art centers, or building, they are the change agent, of what's going on in terms of development of this creativity in Africa. So I think if we're able to do that, obviously we are able to we have changed something, have impacted the way we wanted them to have an impact back on the continent as well.
And you're serving as, as a model, obviously, to enhance, as Butheina was saying too, to sort of encourage, a growth in small cultural enterprises. On that note, and we're going to wrap up with Abdulrahman, because we've gone a little bit over time, and apparently we only have very few minutes. But he has a really interesting practice that he's been, working on with his brother, Brick Lab. So I'd love you to tell us a bit about how you're working, kind of in this fluid structure with architects and designers in Saudi and internationally.
I mean, for us, as kind of our cultural approach towards architecture, we think fundamentally architecture is a cultural asset in itself, especially if we're working on a project that was part of our urban fabric, and only as a, let's say, libraries, museums. That's our aspiration, is to really engage with the public and alleviate our urban forms as a means to kind of reach out to various inhabitants, but also connecting with different fields to kind of question the role of just purely being professionals within any given field in Saudi, but also more so in the rest of the world, and this kind of butterfly effect. So I think for us, one of our major things that we try doing is to engage in curatorial practices where we can generate a conversation with artists and architects alike. We've worked on a book fair to create a platform which was kind of in collaboration with Misk Art Institute and Ethel Gallery. A few years ago, we involved illustrators because they don't have that platform. We don't have a comic book shop or other things. So this was one of the things that we started noticing. Yes, we're building spaces, but there's no actual physical space for illustrators and graphic designers to have a very playful and informal way to showcase their work, other than that being in a gallery, therefore restricting them to the way they display their work. We've worked on a show called Public Private in the historic district along with the Saudi Art Council, where we engaged again with architects and artists alike as a form of expression towards what is our civic right and how do we inhabit public spaces. So I think just to quickly wrap up, I think that's for us, it's with every given project, we try to really critically approach it in a way that can engage various professionals and also engage with the institution that's working with us in a way that's, I would say, different, but also always making their lives harder to kind of push the boundary as much as we can. I don't want to bridge over the time, so I don't want to.
We've run, and unfortunately we do have to wrap this up, and it's and we've had a small technical glitch sort of interrupted it. But I think it's been really wonderful to speak with everybody, and ultimately, you know, to take away from this, because, you know, from every talk that you do, especially, you know, these days when we are still confined to these squares, and that obviously won't be forever, but you know, the beauty ultimately of a small cultural enterprise is also pushing boundaries. You know, you're breaking boundaries. You know, that's innovation. I mean, that's going forward. And sometimes you have to break things open and show something that hasn't been done before in order to kind of make a movement, in order to get more people involved, in order to inspire more people to do you know, creative enterprises. And honestly, that changes society, and it changes the world. I truly believe that. So on that note, I'm, you know, really grateful to have been able to see you all, albeit in these squares, but I'm sure soon in person. And thanks again to the Miss Gart Institute for having us. And yes, see everybody very soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks.